What's going on, everyone? Phil here, and after a fun weekend marathon, I just wrapped up my playthrough of Dishonored 2. Now, similar to the 2012 breakout hit from Bethesda, Dishonored 2 again focuses in on Corvo and his family being thrown into the middle of a political drama where it seems like they're framed for something they didn't do. This time around, you can play as both the original protagonist Corvo or as his daughter Emily. It's pretty cool to be able to play as either of these characters and see that there are different perspectives that they can actually experience the story from, as well as the fact that there's a little bit of difference in their abilities. But does the game live up to the lofty reputation that the original game actually created for it 4 years ago when it was a breakout hit? Let's find out in my review. Before we get started, I feel that there are two incredibly important points that I need to touch upon. First of all, I played Dishonored 2 on the PlayStation 4, and therefore, all of the things that I'm going to say about the game when it comes to technical performance are based off of the performance of it on the original PS4 console. Now, I'm well aware that there are other versions of the game on the Xbox One and the PC. I've actually heard that these games also have massive technical performance issues. I've also heard that if you did happen to purchase the brand new PlayStation 4 Pro, that the game will perform slightly better. However, I'm here to review the original game on the PlayStation 4 console as is. Number 2, I chose to play as Emily through my playthrough of Dishonored 2, and I decided to go for a high chaos run, meaning I tried to kill actively every enemy that I saw, the only exceptions being some of the big boss characters, as I'll explain in this review. Therefore, this review is for Emily and a high chaos side playthrough, which takes about 15.5 hours. If you want more information on a stealthy playthrough or any story differences with Corvo, I do recommend that you seek out someone who actually played that side of the game. At this point, I just don't have another 15.5 hours to spare to do a second playthrough of the game, and although I may do so in the future, I wanted to get this review out as quickly as possible so people can know my thoughts before the game gets too old. So without further ado, here comes my review of the PlayStation 4 version of Dishonored 2, played on the original console with Emily and High Chaos. Dishonored 2 opens up many years after the conclusion of the original game. Emily, who was the daughter of the deceased Empress, now has become the new Empress of Dunwall, and Corvo, her father, now serves as royal protector and her top aide sitting at her side. There's been some things afoot in the Kingdom of Dunwall. There's been a mysterious murderer called the Crown Killer, who seems to be going around assassinating all of the enemies of the Crown, meaning anyone who maybe disagrees with the way that Emily is ruling the country seems to be mysteriously getting killed, and it's a big ongoing mystery who is doing this. Well, the party is crashed when the Duke breaks into the throne room and takes everything over with an army of robot soldiers, followed by Delilah, a mysterious woman who has supernatural powers, who overtakes Corvo and seems to steal his powers, then declares herself the long-lost sister of the deceased Empress, and therefore the rightful ruler of Dunwall. She immediately accuses Emily of being the Crown Killer and going around killing anyone who opposes her, and has her immediately imprisoned. And so Emily has now been regularly usurped from her throne. And now it's up to her to break out of her palace imprisonment and try to find allies in her quest to figure out what the heck is going on. She runs into a sailor named Megan, who seems to be also a mysterious figure with ties to the plot line of the original game. More of this is fleshed out over the course of the story, but with the help of Megan and a ship, she's able to travel all throughout the country, trying to find different associates of the Duke and take them out one by one, as well as trying to solve the mystery of who is the real Crown Killer. And so, as Emily seeks to reclaim her throne, she has a critical choice to make. Should she go violent or non-violent? Should she choose to slaughter recklessly all the troops, the guards, the gang members, the animals, and the various kinds of enemies that'll come at her throughout her missions, including her high-priority targets that are working for the Duke? Or should she choose to be non-violent and try to skulk through the shadows, taking them out with takedowns, sleep darts, and the like to try to retain good karma? Now, my first playthrough of the original game, I decided to go non-violent. So this time around, I went full chaos, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in this review. So, full chaos means you're trying to kill everyone. You can go completely uncontrolled and unhinged. You can be trying to sneak up and just kill every single person that you run into without any kind of worry. You could be chucking grenades and explosives and using incendiary bolts with your crossbow to kill everything that you come across. And so it kind of becomes pretty different from a stealthy playthrough, because unlike a stealthy playthrough, you're not exactly trying to just sneak by everyone without being detected. You're actually actively trying to kill as many people as you can come across. Now, this is good and bad. It's good because it doesn't have the kind of challenge and limitations of trying to do a full stealth run through the game. You don't necessarily have to worry too much about not getting detected, although if you do run into too many enemies at once, it could be a daunting task to try to survive, especially in the early game before you get a lot of necessary upgrades for a chaos run, including increased health and other melee combat abilities. But at the same time, it's a lot of fun to just kind of let loose and be able to use all the different mechanics of the game, including the spring razors that'll kill your enemies by chopping them to ribbons, or tossing grenades and blowing them to holy hell, or even using some of the environmental things to kill people rather than like, oh no, I accidentally killed them, when you're trying to go through a non-violent run. It actually is kind of refreshing to not have to worry about that stuff. But there is one critical issue with this game on the PlayStation 4 that I have to address. That's probably the one huge negative. Immediately when you engage in melee combat on this version of the game, you're going to notice that the frame rate starts to drop. Instead of being the smooth 30 frames per second that it always is, it's going to drop into the 20s, and sometimes, especially if you're fighting multiple enemies at once, as low as the low teens of frames per second. Sadly, this makes melee combat incredibly difficult to deal with in the early game before you end up unlocking the abilities that make it way easier. You're supposed to be able to time a parry by pressing right bumper, and then counterattack with a melee kill by pressing right trigger. Unfortunately, it's so difficult to do so when the frame rate is chugging along, and sometimes you don't even get to see the frames of animation that are the attack of the enemy, so how are you supposed to block and counterattack? The first 3 to 5 hours of Dishonored 2 trying to do a melee combat style chaos run are incredibly difficult because you don't have the abilities that make it easier, and the frame rate keeps dropping. I don't know what happened to this version of the game, and I've actually heard there's tons of similar issues both on the PC and Xbox One versions, so it certainly doesn't seem like it's isolated only to this one. That's a huge shame because it really does hinder your ability to have the freedom to play the game how you want. I actually would say that at least for the first 5 hours, it's really not very fun to play a chaos run because you're not trying to sneak by every enemy, and you're trying to actively kill everyone, and it ends up becoming way more of a chore than it should be simply because the melee combat isn't working. Now, the good news is that once you actively start to seek out the collectibles in the environment, you start to level up your character, you'll get better melee combat abilities, and it becomes incredibly easy, to the point which, I'll even say this, by the end of my playthrough, I felt incredibly overpowered. I was taking on entire areas, rooms of enemies, gauntlets of dozens of enemies back to back to back, never dying because I had unlocked so many great abilities seeking out these optional collectibles. So let's talk a little bit about them. Early on in the game, after your first visit to the Void, you get a heart. It's actually supposed to be the removed heart of your deceased Empress Mother. Ugh, talk about gruesome. As you hold this heart, all of the icons referring to the hidden optional collectibles in a stage will be revealed to you, including their distance from you and the relative height to where you're standing. Therefore, you can go on a collection quest and make it your mission to try to find every hidden room, every optional way through a building to try to get all of these collectibles. Now, there's two kinds of collectibles. Bone charms, which you equip. These are little charms that give you different abilities. For example, maybe you can swim longer underwater. Maybe you do more damage with a melee attack. Maybe you'll heal by killing a certain type of enemy. There's tons of these throughout the game, and there's actually a pretty simple crafting system. If you get a bone charm and you don't necessarily like it, you could break it down into components to make other bone charms. If you start to run out of space to equip bone charms, you can actually break them down and make a bone charm that has 4 attributes instead of just 1. It's a pretty simple process, but it is pretty interesting and it adds to the complexity of the system. Now, the other collectible is called a rune. This is basically a stat point. You'll touch the item, you'll get a stat point, and you use these stat points in order to unlock new abilities. There's powers, which are more of the supernatural powers that you're probably used to from Dishonored 1, like the ability to jump from one space to another without actually having to physically do it. It's cool when you can go long distances and jump around a map and do platforming without ever having to press the jump button. There's also things like Shadow Kill, where you turn into a big mysterious shadow monster and instantly execute enemies. It's pretty cool, but for the most part, since I was doing a Chaos run, I decided to focus on enhancements rather than anything else. These are more physical upgrades to your person, such as getting more health, being able to parry more easily, having a bigger window to parry melee attacks, being able to do multiple melee kills in a string of attacks, and also being able to charge up an instant kill that made it incredibly easy once I got it going with melee combat. Like I said, near the end of this game, I was hacking my way through mounds of enemies as they came at me. They literally could barely do any damage, and especially because I had a bone charm that made damage deal to my mana meter instead of my HP, man, did I become a tank. And so my run through Dishonored 2 ended up being a bloody hacking mess, where it didn't really matter that the frame rate was tanking every single time that combat started, because I had become such of a tank-like character. I could literally just try to mash and then counter every once in a while and end up clearing entire rooms of enemies. It was gruesome, but it was also fun. One of the key selling points of Dishonored 2 is the fact that there's not just one way to do anything. Much like the first game, there's tons of ways to get from point A to point B and to sneak up on your unsuspecting targets. For example, if one of your targets is inside of a fortress that seems to be heavily guarded, you can either go gung-ho and try to take on those forces head first, or maybe you want to be a little bit more sneaky and try to disable all of the defenses and try to sneak in a little bit more stealthily, or maybe you want to look for an open window that just happens to be way high up that someone forgot to close, or vice versa. Maybe you want to look down on the ground level for a back door or hidden sewer passage that'll get you in. And the bottom line is that in most of the locations that I played in Dishonored 2, I ended up finding multiple ways to do it, to the point where I would walk in and realize, oh, there was this way that over here that I just discovered, and there was also this way, and it was pretty neat to see the ingenious level design that was actually put into the game. I definitely enjoyed that. Now, outside of just the main targets and objectives, there's also a significant amount of side objectives in Dishonored 2. Unlike a game where really you only have one main objective, you're going to run into people who maybe need your help. You're going to run into things such as, oh, there's an apartment that's locked and there's a rumor that there's a lot of loot inside. Of course, you're going to want as much loot as possible, because the more money you get, the more items and upgrades you can purchase at the black market vendors that are spread throughout the game. So not only are you going to want to try to be killing these critical targets and or advancing the plot line, you're also going to want to do your due diligence in trying to find the most loot and complete the most amount of side objectives possible as well. And I really like the fact that everywhere that you go in the game, there are these different objectives that you can get immersed in. I found myself sometimes being lost for some upwards of a half hour trying to complete a side objective, just to realize, oh man, I never actually went after my target, and then going that as well. So it's pretty neat, it's immersive, it's fun, and there's definitely a lot of attention to detail in the level design. Now, in addition to these side content and the main assassinations that you need to perform, there's also some cool mechanics that take place in certain stages. Now, I don't want to spoil too much about the game and uncover so much about it that you don't want to play it, but there is one stage that was actually revealed at E3 that ended up being my favorite stage of the game. You're inside of a manor that's decrepit. It's fallen apart into disrepair, but you need to find a way to get through it, and obviously to loot it and to find your objectives. You're given a special item that allows you to time travel, meaning you can go to the past and into this manor before it ever fell apart. Now, the good news is this means that you can pretty much traverse the manor as much as you want, except that a few doors will be locked, but of course you can always find the keys if you're creative. The problem, though, is that there's going to be enemies everywhere. Guards are patrolling the manor and you have to fight your way through. So a really creative thing that you can do is go into the past, progress until maybe you run into a couple enemies, zip back to the present, walk behind where the enemies are in the past, then zip back to the past and execute them from behind. It's cool. It's an awesome mechanic that I haven't really seen in other games before, and the fact that you can use a crystalline lens to see from one time period to the other is really neat. And also, there are some really awesomely set out puzzles in this mode that I thought were some of the most creative things that I've done in gaming for a while. I'll give you one example to not spoil too much. There is a safe that is encased in this kind of crystalline structure that's called the bloodfly nest. Unfortunately, you can't get to it, so what you do is you go back in time and you find out the source of that bloodfly nest is a dead dog that was left on the floor, became infected with the blood flies, and grew into this giant thing. So you pick up that dead dog, you toss it into an oven, you burn it, you go back to the present, and guess what? The blood fly stuff is gone. So now you can go back to the past, you can go back to the present, excuse me, find the combination for the safe on the open safe that's now been thrown onto the ground, go back to the past, input that combination, and get all the goodies inside. That's the kind of ingenious puzzle that is in this stage, and it really did feel to me like this might have been the stage they put the most care and effort into, because this is what they were showing off at E3 this year. And that's great, except for two critical problems. Number one, whenever you have that crystalline lens up in order to see either the present or the past from wherever you happen to be, the frame rate dips again, making it in certain situations almost impossible to see what you're supposed to be seeing, and almost a chore to the point where I just kept putting the lens away because the frame rate dipped so much it was pissing me off. Number two, this is the only portion of the game out of all 9 major stages that there are. This one stage is the only one that uses the time manipulation mechanic. So yeah, there is a little bit of difference in creativity here in the sequel in this one particular stage, but outside of that, most of the rest of Dishonored 2 ends up kind of feeling like the original game, and that's not necessarily a great thing, but it's not a bad thing. If you liked the original game, then you're probably going to like Dishonored 2, but if you were looking for a lot more advancement when it comes to the game, there's not necessarily that much of it. It just seems to me like they tried to play it safe, except for this one particular time manipulation stage where they got really creative, but I honestly was looking for a little bit more. Why couldn't they have had this manipulation mechanic used in several stages? Why couldn't there have been maybe 1 or 2 other things that were creative and different that could have been used in several stages instead of just the simple trying to find a way to break in? In my opinion, I really felt a little bit underwhelmed, and the fact that the frame rate constantly kept dipping also nagged at the back of my head for most of the playthrough. And so, how you honestly feel about Dishonored 2 will probably depend about what kind of a person you are and if the things that nagged at me will nag at you as a gamer. Ultimately, I felt that the game didn't innovate enough. The one stage that felt different because of time manipulation was far too quick, and the other 8 stages kind of were interesting until you realize it's more about the same formula as the first game than anything else. That's kind of disappointing. It's cool that there's 2 characters and that there's replayability. You'll probably want to play this game twice, while a lot of people probably only played the original game once. But at the same time, they played it safe, and they really didn't innovate too much. The little bit that they did innovate is disappointing because it's over so quickly. And so, it really is a mixed bag for me. The graphics themselves did hold back this game a lot in my mind's eye, and I'm going to be honest with everyone here. If there were no graphical issues with Dishonored 2 on the PlayStation 4, I probably would have given this game a 9 or above. But I cannot in good conscience give this game a stellar rating and make it a Game of the Year contender like that when I know that it has a glaring bad optimization issue that needs to be addressed. And yes, this may be fixed by a patch in a week or 2, or, you know, who knows what Bethesda will do in the future, and Arcane Studios, the actual game devs, maybe they'll fix it. But I have to review the game right now after I've beaten it, and right now the game doesn't run very well, probably about 30% of the time when you're in combat or there's a lot going on, and that is a freaking issue. So I give Dishonored 2 an 8.5 out of 10. It's still an outstanding game, it's still a fun game, and it still is a game that if you enjoyed the first one, you should definitely play this one. But the glaring issues and the lack of innovation, except for one stage, really forced me to say, you know what, overall, I don't think that the experience I got out of the sequel was quite as good as the original game when I played it. Although I do like it and I recommend it, I cannot say it was as good as the first one, so I give it an 8.5 out of 10. Well, that is it for my review of Dishonored 2, and I hope that you enjoyed it, everyone. Keep in mind, this is just of the Emily side and the Chaos run. If you do want more details about the Stealth and or Corvo, you should definitely check out someone else's review, because sadly, I just don't have another 15 plus hours to play, but I hope that this at least gave you a general idea of what to expect with the game. If you liked the review, please give it a like here on YouTube, please spread the word about it, and please consider subscribing to KO Gaming, because there'll be a lot more of this style of review coming out shortly, and my year-end series are coming up quick. quickly, which I'm sure you're going to enjoy. Please check out the video description where you can find a link to my raw playthrough of this game, as well as my discount code for Loot Crate and my Patreon. Thanks a lot, everyone. I appreciate your view. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you'll check out future content right here on KO Gaming. Peace out.